Saturday, April 13th, 1912 was the fourth day of Titanic's maiden voyage, the ship having departed Southampton on Wednesday just after noon. It was only the second full day on the North Atlantic. A sense of routine was just beginning to settle in on the new liner, and this day would prove to be a splendid one. The day dawned with broken cloud cover. Titanic had been facing 20-knot headwinds overnight, and she was approaching a cold front that had lay northwest of her track. However, the temperatures would again prove to be rather mild, peaking out at nearly 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15.5 Celsius by noon. That morning, Captain Smith and his officers again performed their daily duty of inspecting the ship. This photograph was taken aboard the White Star liner Adriatic just a couple of years before, and shows what this inspection may have looked like on Titanic. That day, time aboard Titanic was running 2 hours and 47 minutes ahead of New York time, and 2 hours and 13 minutes behind Greenwich time back in London. A brief word is in order here about procedures involving keeping time aboard Titanic. Quite simply, Titanic's clocks were not changed by a whole hour as she passed a divider between each of the time zones between English time and New York time, which were 5 hours apart. Instead, timekeeping aboard the ship was intimately connected with her navigation. Every noon, Titanic's officers would fix their position at the moment when the sun was at its highest elevation in the sky. During the afternoon, they would calculate their anticipated location along their track where they expected to be when the sun would reach its highest elevation in the sky again, and then they would decide how much to adjust the ship's clocks overnight so that shipboard time would read 12 o'clock at the moment when the sun reached its zenith in the sky. In general terms, then the ship's speed dictated the amount of the overnight clock set back each night. In the evening, just before dinner, the amount of the anticipated time change would be posted throughout public spaces so that, before they went to bed, passengers could adjust their personal timepieces and would not miss breakfast the following morning. If this procedure sounds absurdly complex, it actually really was complicated. However, officers on crack liners like Titanic were very, very good at such calculations. In fact, Third Officer Pittman later recalled that if there was any need for an adjustment between the speed the ship had planned to make and the speed she had actually made, such tweaks were usually discovered and made each morning and would only amount to half a minute or a minute. Timekeeping aboard Titanic was largely kept via a system of magneto-electrical clocks. About 50 so-called slave clocks in various passenger and crew locations throughout the ship were tied into a low-voltage electrical circuit run by a pair of master clocks in the ship's chart room. Once every 60 seconds, the master clocks would send an electrical impulse throughout the circuit and cause each of the slave clocks to advance by 1 minute in time. The slave clocks all had to be set perfectly with each other when the system was first started up, but once that was done, this sort of setup was a very efficient way of making sure that proper ship's time was carried on the major clocks around the ship. Traveling westbound, each of Titanic's days were longer than 24 hours, whereas on an eastbound trip, each day aboard would have been less than 24 hours long. At noon, it was discovered that Titanic had steamed 519 nautical miles since noon the preceding day, at an average of 20.91 knots. This run was a disappointment to many aboard. Assistant Purser Reginald Barker quipped to Lawrence Beasley over lunch that they would probably dock in New York on Wednesday morning instead of Tuesday night, as they had expected. Down below, word was passed to the stokers for more speed. The firemen put their backs into it, and engine RPMs increased soon to 75. At about 1:30 that afternoon, first-class passenger Elizabeth Lyons was enjoying some after-lunch coffee in the first-class reception room on D-deck. Soon, two men, who she identified as Captain Smith and Bruce Ismay, came in. Eventually, she noticed that they were discussing Titanic's daily runs. Ismay was visibly excited over the success of his new ship. Titanic was clearly making better time than her sister Olympic had made on her maiden voyage. The boilers were standing the pressure of full steam quite nicely, he noted. The ship would certainly make a better run up to noon on Sunday than they had this day. Miss Lyons noticed Captain Smith nodding in the affirmative to Ismay's enthusiastic comments, but observed that the conversation was not much of a conversation at all, since Smith was saying nothing. You see, they are standing the pressure, everything is going well, the boilers are working well, Ismay said. We can do better tomorrow, we'll make a better run tomorrow. Ismay thought that they could put a little more steam on and increase the ship's speed further still. Then she heard Ismay say, we'll beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday. While some have tried to cast a conspiratorial tone on the conversation, the most that can reasonably be concluded, assuming Lyons was being truthful and accurately recalling events, is that Ismay was enthusiastic about the performance of White Star's brand new ship and excited by the possibility of it beating the Olympic's maiden voyage crossing time and arriving early in New York to headlines. There is no clear evidence to suggest that Ismay was pressuring Captain Smith or issuing any commands or directives of any kind. There was good news that came from the stokers that day as well. Contrary to what has been reported in media in recent years, instead of getting worse, the coal bunker fire had actually been extinguished that day. Leading fireman Charles Henriksen recalled that the fire was not out much before all the coal was out. He and the 3 or 4 men that were working with him finished the bunker out. Only then, with the fire out and the bunker wholly empty of coal, could anyone get a look at the fire's effects. Henriksen and leading fireman Frederick Barrett had a look for themselves. Barrett recalled that the bulkhead which ran through the bunker was damaged from the bottom. The bottom of the watertight compartment was dinged aft and the other part was dinged forward. Henriksen said that he could see where the bulkhead had been red hot. All the paint and everything was off. It was dented a bit. He recalled that it was warped. So he brushed it off and got some black oil and rubbed over it. In the end, headlines seeking claims to the contrary, the damage was very minor, and there is absolutely zero evidence that it played a significant role of any kind during the sinking. Meanwhile, Walter and Mahala Douglas were strolling along the promenade deck, enjoying the fine weather and the fresh favoring winds which had seemed to caress their entire crossing. They noticed a nearby seaman lowering a weighted pail towards the sea so that he could retrieve a sample and take the temperature of the water. Curious to view this bit of shipboard routine, Mrs. Douglas watched from one of the open promenade deck windows. She wondered if the pail would manage to reach the water, or if it would simply be buffeted about in the breeze. The bucket, in the end, did not make it to the water, and the seaman drew it back up, filled it with water from the standpipe, placed the thermometer in it, and went with it to the officer in charge. First-class passenger Renee Harris, wife of theatrical producer Henry B. Harris, recalled that there was a spirit of camaraderie unlike any I'd experienced on previous trips. No one consulted the passenger list to judge from the air of good fellowship that prevailed amongst the cabin passengers. They met on deck as one big party. First-class passenger Mae Futrell, who spent much time with the Harrises during the voyage, recalled being particularly cautious about the Astlers during the crossing. Someone had pointed out the Astlers to us. Of course I, with every other woman on board, was curious about them. His height and her smart little figure would have made them noticeable in any circumstances. She was wearing a pretty ermine cap, and we used to spot it all over the ship, for they moved about among us very freely. They were all alone most of the time. Perhaps they would have been rather glad to scrape up a few acquaintances. I used to think so when I saw her glance up from her reading at everyone who passed, but of course the rest of us felt that it would have been rather presumptuous to make the first move. On one of the nights during the voyage, possibly on April 13th, first-class passengers Elmer Taylor, his wife, and his friend Fletcher Williams were in the reception room listening to music from the ship's orchestra. Taylor recalled, Williams was a democratic sort of chap and did not hesitate to move among the high, the less high, or lowly. So after dinner he selected a table for coffee in the reception room next to a table at which Captain Smith was entertaining a party. We were close enough to hear Captain Smith tell his party that ship could be cut crosswise in 3 places, and each piece would float. Taylor placed this event on Sunday evening. However, the specific reference to Captain Smith being in the reception room after dinner does not fit in with the known movements of Captain Smith on Sunday night. According to many, Smith was in the first-class restaurant and then headed directly to the bridge on that evening. This means that this event must have occurred on a previous night during the crossing, and Taylor was confused. One of the things that Beasley enjoyed doing was to stand on the boat deck, in the angle between lifeboats 13 and 15 on the starboard side, and watch the general motion of the ship through the waves resolve itself in two motions. One to be observed by contrasting the docking bridge, from which the log line trailed away behind the foaming wake with the horizon, and observing the long, slow heave as we rode up and down. The second motion was a side-to-side roll, and can be calculated by watching the port rail and contrasting it with the horizon as before. Late Saturday evening, the eastbound Furnace Withy vessel Rappahannock emerged from a heavy rain squall and found herself a beam of Titanic, which, with all her lights glowing, made a splendid picture as she passed. Rappahannock's Chief Officer Smith estimated that Titanic was then making about 21 knots, and it did not take long before she disappeared into the darkness astern of the smaller ship. At 8 p.m. that night, Senior Marconi operator Jack Phillips sat down at the key for his 6-hour shift, and his assistant Harold Bride turned in. At 11 p.m., just 3 hours into his watch, Phillips began to have significant trouble with the wireless apparatus. Soon, he roused Bride from his slumber so that the junior operator could help Phillips get to the bottom of the problem. Only if they could find the trouble could they, perhaps, put it to right. At first, Phillips thought the issue was that the condensers had broken. The pair rummaged around the inner workings of the set until they had pulled out the condensers and examined them for signs of damage. It turned out that Phillips' first instinct was off the mark. However, the condensers were in perfect shape. Phillips and Bride then had to find the real cause of the problem. They were put to a deal of trouble before discovering the source of the difficulty. It turned out that the leads from the secondary of the transformer had burned through inside the casing and made contact with some of the iron bolts which held the woodwork and frame together, thereby earthing the power to a great extent. With the problem found, the solution was not long in coming. After binding these leads with rubber tape, Bride recalled, we once more had the apparatus in perfect working order. However, the repairs had taken quite some time, and the system was only working once more by 4:30 or 5. Throughout the day on Sunday, the two exhausted men would be forced to deal with a backlog of messages, and it must have seemed that they would never catch up. While Phillips and Bride toiled to repair the wireless set, at midnight the ship's clocks were set back. The clocks in the public spaces were set back by 45 minutes to 11:15 p.m. As was the typical custom, the first night watch took a portion of the adjustment, in this case 23 minutes, and the second watch took 22 minutes. Titanic would continue to steam westward throughout the night, through calm seas, its lights reflecting on the surface of the ocean. Nobody knew that it would soon be entering its last full day afloat.
A special thank you to our supporters on Patreon: NikkiChan92, Evan Plemming, Lucas Sidlowski, Bluebird Nut, Mark Gegenheimer, Martin Cahill, Maximilian Metcalf, Rachel Warner Sanchez, and Snow Monkey.